Multivalent motives: the influence of metrical context on attack salience in Guinean Malinke dance drumming. Time to a steady beat, a cleverly arranged pattern of notes cycles repeatedly within a fixed span of time, providing an opportunity for a culturally attuned listener to hear a rich set of rhythmically exciting melodies. Composers fix multi-determinate components into their musical designs, performers bring this multifaceted condition into being, and listeners actively participate in hearing the multivalent potential of a familiar item of repertory. Music like this presents to the mind's musical ear multiple simultaneous views that are constantly in a condition of non-resolving metamorphosis. David Locke, The Metric Matrix. This paper analyzes the interplay of motivic shape and context in Guinean Malinke dance drumming, arguing that it is not only the mellow rhythmic shape of motives, but also their relationships to contextualizing temporal cycles that give them meaning. Temporal organization in this genre is governed by a combination of temporal cycles that interact as the music unfolds, allowing uncultured performers, dancers, and listeners to actively engage with the sounds through entrained prediction. As I will show, metrical complexity in this genre is heightened in two specific ways: by the inclusion of an asymmetrical timeline as one of the temporal cycles, and by the co-importance of both the quarter and dotted quarter cycles in compound time. This non-nesting of metrical cycles ensures that motives on the musical surface may be heard in multiple contexts simultaneously. Guinean Malinke dance drumming. The Malinke of Guinea, a Mande subgroup, perform life cycle and recreational dance rhythms using a combination of hand drums, stick drums, and bells. Ensembles typically comprised of 3 to 8 musicians play overlapping patterns in support of a lead drummer whose part is largely improvised in connection to the dancers. The polyrhythmic texture of this music is made up of 3 types of parts: a background of multi-use patterns of between 1 and 4 beats, played on supporting djembes, bells, and the smallest stick drum, the kenkeni; a middle ground of unique mellow rhythmic conversations between the middle and largest drums, sangban and dundumba; and a foreground of improvised licks performed by a single lead djembe player at a time. Example 1 shows one cycle of Ja 2 as published by Mamadi Keita, with background, middle ground, and foreground parts labeled. This paper focuses on the middle ground parts, exploring the ways in which their construction lends itself to multivalent hearing. Example 2 extracts the middle ground of Ja 2, the mellow rhythmic conversation between the dundumba and sangban drums. Now let's listen to the same pattern with a shaker highlighting the dotted quarter context. Then the same pattern, this time with a bell highlighting the quarter note context. Finally, we'll hear it with both contexts simultaneously. Notice how some attacks are clearly in alignment with, or more consonant with, one or the other of these cycles. This is the type of multivalent hearing I hope to demonstrate. The corpus I'm working with is made up of scores for 71 Malinke dance pieces published by former National Ballet drummers Mamadi Keita, Farah Tolno, Bemba Bangura, and Famadou Konate. As shown in example 1, each piece is represented by one cycle of time with a combination of djembe parts, bell parts, and dundun parts. Malinke drummers who teach in the West codify particular combinations of parts in order to transmit what they consider representative versions of pieces played for particular dances. Whereas in Guinea, apprentice drummers pick up the unspoken rules of pattern combination, variation, and improvisation over years of listening and participating, These published scores supply snapshots of potential textures that would be created in the moment in Guinea. My analytical work untangles and classifies these combinations, seeking to elicit what Simha Aram calls the quote, implicit laws, which the performers themselves cannot state theoretically, although they make systematic use of them in practice, underlying this genre of polyrhythm. Many Malinke meters. According to Justin London's many meters hypothesis, quote, a listener's metric competence resides in her or his knowledge of a very large number of context-specific metrical timing patterns. The number and degree of individuation among these patterns increases with age, training, and degree of musical enculturation. According to London, quote, metric attending in almost all cases will involve three levels of structure: the overall metrical cycle, the beat cycle, and the end cycle. Gerhard Kubik presents a concept of cross-culturally valid African timing, which also incorporates three temporal levels, which he calls the cycle, reference beat, and elementary pulsations. Kubik adds a fourth temporal level, which applies only to certain regions of Africa, the timeline. Timelines are rhythmic patterns often associated with bells that serve as accompaniments and schemes of reference. Guinean Malinke dance drumming is not a genre typically associated with timelines in the literature. Although less obvious than timelines in nearby Guinean styles such as Ponlogo and Gahu, where the timeline is expressed by a particular instrument, a bell, and therefore stands out within the texture, I find that timelines are a present and active force in Guinean musics. I argued in an earlier paper that timelines in Guinean musics are created in a way that I call collaboratively between all the instruments in the texture, that there are points of coalescence between all the parts. Many timelines, but not all, are asymmetrical. Table 1 summarizes the collaborative timelines used in Guinean Malinke dance drumming. Example 3 shows Kubik and London's conceptions of musical time side by side. The question of polymeter. The conflicting views on polymeter, whether there can be more than one beat cycle, are represented by traditional meter theory on one side and ethnomusicological insights on the other. The typical focus is on compound time and the possibility of hearing in 12/8, 4 dotted quarters per measure, and 6/4, 6 quarters per measure, simultaneously. I add to this dichotomy the inclusion of timelines as potential beat cycles. Traditional meter theory clearly supports a single beat cycle. According to Lerdahl and Jackendorf's metrical well-formedness rule 2, quote, every beat at a given level must also be a beat at all smaller levels present at that point in the piece, which rules out a simultaneous dotted quarter and quarter note beat. In David Temperley's recasting of these rules, it becomes metrical well-formedness rule 1, quote, every beat at a given level must be a beat at all lower levels. London states as his metrical well-formedness constraint 1.3, quote, a meter may only have one beat cycle. Aware of the pull toward multiple beat cycles in African musics, London accounts for this later, saying, quote, unlike Western music, in African drumming performances, those complex rhythmic textures are repeated many times, and thus the pattern of conflicting cues persists longer than in the case of a local hemiola. This persistence gives the listener the opportunity, once he or she has latched onto a particular metrical framework, to then reconstrue the meter. Thus, according to London, listeners only entrain one type of beat at a time and are able to switch back and forth quickly in order to appreciate the ways in which the musical surface plays with multiple beat types. Many ethnomusicologists have posited the existence of multiple simultaneous beat streams in African music. A. M. Jones writes, quote, we have to grasp the fact that if from childhood you are brought up to regard beating 3 against 2 as being just as normal as beating in synchrony, then you develop a two-dimensional attitude to rhythm, which we in the West do not share. This is apparently a denial of our insistence on the constancy of the basic unit of time. For if you play permanently 2 rhythms 3 against 2, what you're really doing is employing 2 basic time units. Gerhard Kubik finds that, quote, many of the form or cycle numbers can be divided or split in more than one way, thus allowing for the simultaneous combination of contradictory metrical units. For example, the number 12, which is the most important form number in African music, can be divided by 2, 3, 4, and 6. Geoffrey Pressing explicitly invokes polymeter, quote, "More than one pulse stream may be simultaneously produced as an outcome of the rhythmic patterns, as is common in West African polymetric drum ensemble music, especially that with a cycle length of 6, 12, or 24 time units." J. Ron brings up the Gestalt rabbit and duck illusion, arguing that, quote, "Just as there is no contradiction in seeing on any particular occasion a given drawing both as a drawing of a duck and a drawing of a rabbit, there is no contradiction in hearing or feeling a passage as simultaneously both in 6/8 and 3/4, nor as at the same time both foursquare and diatonic in rhythm." Writing of Afro-Cuban music, Christopher Stover goes so far as to conclude, quote, "More important than switching readily between them, though, the performer and the properly entrained listener as well must actually be able to perceive both metric constructs simultaneously in order to communicate with the music in a way that is consonant with so-called proper performance practice, and that it is a necessary early stage in the progression toward insiderness that one learn to do so with ease." David Locke provides the most systematic analytical approach to polymeter in African dance drumming. He conceives of meter as a, quote, "matrix," a multidimensional dynamic condition in which several beat streams, metric fields, coexist simultaneously. Locke's metric matrix includes all even temporal divisions from many starting points. Locations on the musical surface are understood relative to these multiple contexts, which creates, quote, "simultaneous multidimensionality, a condition in which music is coherent from several perspectives at the same time." Locke's ternary quadruple metric matrix is reproduced in example 4. Locke's matrix accounts for an exhaustive collection of time points, all of which are exploited in the Ewe and Dagomba musics he writes about. Notice two things: that Locke's metrical cycles do not all nest within one another, and that he does not give the timeline the status of a metrical cycle. He, of course, speaks of the importance of the timeline, referring to certain attacks in the musical texture as being heard, quote, "offbeat but on bell, so to speak." In my conception, Malinke meters are made up of 5 temporal cycles: the overall repeating cycle of each piece, the isochronous tactus, the timeline, another isochronous cycle, and the subdivisions. Example 5 shows 2 typical Malinke meters, one in simple time and one in compound time. As you can see, there are cycles in each of these meters that do not nest within one another. For examples of motives that exploit the non-nesting metrical cycles in a way that creates depth, we'll start with some simple time pieces. In the following examples, I will make the metrical cycles clear by assigning each of them a sound, a shaker or a bell. These sounds are not to be considered accompaniments, rather they are a way of externalizing the metrical frameworks that an encultured listener hears through. Example 6 shows the middle ground of Keita's realization of Soli Woolen. We consider this motive versus 2 of the metrical cycles, the eighth notes and the timeline. The interest in this middle ground part lies in the 2/16 notes on the and of beat 1. Relative to the eighth note and timeline cycles, they swap, being on and off time points. As a pair, they may be said to be moving to the timeline cycle while moving from the eighth note cycle. On the score, I use a green and blue triangle to show these momenta. As 3/3/2 is the most common simple time timeline, many pieces in the Guinean Malinke dance drumming repertoire play on the simultaneous strength and weakness of the 3rd 16th note. Another piece that does so, Dibon, is shown in example 7. First we see the score for the middle ground parts, Sangban and Dunumba drums. I then identify the pairs of 16th notes to analyze. These pairs are then coded to green and from blue relative to the 8th note metrical cycle. They are then coded to and from, in this case they're all 2, which I find fascinating, relative to the timeline cycle. Finally, we see the combined vectors for Debon. In compound time pieces, much of the metrical complexity comes from the equal importance of the dotted quarter and quarter note cycles. This is shown in example 8, Keita's Kanden 2. Here, the songbon attacks switch between dotted quarters and quarters halfway through the measure. The 3 pairs of dundunba attacks are all neutral relative to the dotted quarter cycle, shown with gold ovals. Versus the quarter note cycle, the dundun pairs are 2 from. Finally, we hear the 2 contexts simultaneously. In the handful of compound time pieces with asymmetrical timelines, the complexity is greater because here there are 3 metrical cycles vying for beat cycle status: the dotted quarter, quarter, and timeline. For the next example, Bemba Bangora's version of Manjani, we'll first listen to the entire texture shown in example 9. Example 10 shows the middle ground of the piece, which utilizes a 2-3-3-2-2 timeline. Here, the third songbon attack is the focal point of metrical interest, in addition to the typical changing momenta of the double 8th notes in the dundunba part. The third songbon attack is offbeat relative to both the dotted quarter and quarter cycles, but the fact that it aligns with the timeline affords it a special kind of metrical salience. In this paper, I have approached the issue of polymeter in Guinean Malinke dance drumming, focusing on one of the 3 textural layers in this genre, which I call the middle ground. These mellow rhythmic conversations between 2 bass drums are played and understood within the context of multiple metrical cycles, which I've shown using notation and recordings. The ability to hear and phrase music relative to multiple contexts is key to understanding and playing in this style, and it is one way in which Guinean Malinke dance drumming achieves its depth and complexity.